So welcome everyone. I wanted to introduce the community to our next workshop presenters. We're going to have a panel discussion moderated by Gregory or Greg. Why don't you introduce yourself and what you do and how it's connected to the adoption and foster care community?
I'm sure. My name's Gregory Luce. I'm an attorney in Minnesota, but I'm also the founder of Adoptee Rights Law Center and the president of Adoptees United, Inc., a national nonprofit. And so my relationship to adoption is I'm also a DC adoptee, born and adopted in the District of Columbia. And I represent adult adoptees on issues related to birth records, citizenship, or identity documents.
Wow. Okay, let's go to Gabrielle. Gabrielle, how are you connected to everything here in the adoption and foster care community?
I'm not personally connected except through the book that I just wrote and worked on for the last Margaret, it's been what, 5 years? 5 years. I wrote a book called American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, which tells the story of my late friend, David Rosenberg, who was an adoptee, surrendered by Margaret Katz in 1962. She was coerced into having to do that. And I used their dual narratives to tell the story of secret closed adoptions in the United States that really persisted nationwide and involved at least 3.5 million birth mothers and their 3.5 million sons and daughters.
Margaret, why don't you introduce yourself and why don't you give a little bit of why you felt that your story was important to everyone to be able to be put into a book?
I'm Margaret Earl Katz, and I had no idea this was going to go into a book. I was first approached by Gabrielle after David had passed, and when I finally got to meet David and spend 3 weeks with him, we talked about it and we said, this should not be happening to anybody else. Neither of us had any idea of the broadness of the industry of adoption. And the main thing at that point was the medical, because I thought he had all the medical information. Nothing was passed on to him. And I think he would have lived a lot longer and not have gone through pain of different things that my husband had that I had notified the agency with and never got to him. And then after that, when Gabrielle presented doing the book, we both felt, it would be much broader, we'll get to more people. There was a New York Times article that Gabrielle did in July 2015 or 6, was it 15? I don't remember, I'm sorry.
15, yeah.
Yeah, and from that, tons of people came out of the woodwork and said, contacted Gabrielle, contacted me. This happened to my family. I had no idea that this was this broad. And then as Gabrielle did more and more research that she shared with me, I realized what was going on. And it was going on with so many different agencies. And, it was mind-boggling and shocking. And there were so many entities because I felt the adoptive parents should have a right to know the truth of where their children came from. And also the adoptees should have a right to know where they came from and their medical records. And even birth mothers like me, the horror of not knowing what happened to your child. For birth parents, for most people, I presume, are nightmares all the time. At least if you know what happened, you can sleep at night. And, it was just, I could not believe everything that had gone on all these years, and things are still going on now. And I felt any way that I could help to change that was important.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So kind of taking off something that Margaret just stated, Greg, why you do the Adoptee Law Center. I can obviously, what made you, what are we missing as a community of why you need a law center for adoptees? I know that's but there's a lot of pieces that people don't know that adoptees go through and the rights that they have or don't have. Why did you feel that you needed to do that?
It came out of my own story and how long it took me to get my own records, which I consider part of my full identity. And by records, I typically mean the original birth record, which after an adoption is sealed and made unavailable to adopted people, often permanently. And those records are considered essentially state secrets. So it was my 15 to 20 year personal effort to get that record that ended only a few months ago. But in 2017, I said, well, I'm a lawyer. This is incredibly hard to do as a lawyer. I can't imagine adopted people trying to do it on their own. So I created sort of the love of my life, this work to represent adult adopted people who want to seek out and obtain their original birth records. That's expanded essentially as well to intercountry adoptees who in the US often do not have US citizenship, even though they've been adopted by US citizen parents. So I represent both intercountry adoptees and domestic adoptees on those issues.
I was watching the C-SPAN a couple of years ago when the New York was just about, luckily, to pass the OBC bill, and I started jumping up and down. Why there was an opposing argument. There was only like one or two, but I remember watching the entire thing. It was only opposing argument of, but you know, birth families going into this want secrecy. Well, why? Because there's so many people who don't know the ins and outs of the adoptee's journey. Why is this so important for an adoptee to have an OBC? But I want the community to understand what's so important about having your original birth certificate. I don't get it.
Oftentimes, if you're not an adopted person, many people do not get it because they take it for granted that if they needed their own birth certificate that had the facts of their birth, they just apply, pay $15 to $20 and they receive it. Often adopted people don't even realize that they have two birth certificates. And I realized later in life, as probably my late 20s, that there's actually an original birth record. And so why you want it, there could be any number of reasons. People may want it for their records. I've seen that's probably the most honest answer. They just want that record of their birth that gives them the information that they need to claim their essentially connection to the earth or their full identity. And what they do with that record is really up to the individual adopted person. They may seek out and try to find the birth parents listed on the record, or they may do nothing. But the importance is the full identity, and it's a right to identity that I believe we have and we are pursuing.
Gabrielle, how did you find yourself? What triggered you to start this idea of trying to get this story out there? I saw that you did an interview about post-war. A lot of people don't realize what happened post-war. What triggered you to say, you know what, I'm going to write a book to share this? Why was it so important for you to get this? Because it just came out in January, am I correct?
Right. I was a newspaper reporter in Oregon in the early 2000s, and I covered adoption and assisted reproductive technology. I covered surrogacy, and that's how I wound up getting introduced to David Rosenberg, who was an adopted guy in Portland who was getting a kidney donation from a friend. And in 2007, I wrote a story in which he told me during our first interview that he hoped the story would go viral, and that his birth mother would see it and somehow recognize him as her son. And the story did go viral, and a lot of people donated kidneys as a result, but the story did not go viral in the way that David had hoped, and which was going to ultimately lead him to Margaret. So long story short, they ultimately reunited because it was prior to the New York laws opening original birth certificates for adoptees. They reunited with a DNA test. And when David called me to tell me that his entire narrative that he'd had his entire life, that he'd been quote unquote given up, that he'd have somehow been an inconvenience to his mother. He learned the opposite in the first conversation that he ever had with her in 2014. And to me, understanding that news as a human being, understanding that news as a journalist, understanding that news as an investigative reporter, the narrative was incredibly compelling of this mother and son who had located each other after 52 years of forced separation. But what was beyond that was, okay, that's a story. What's behind the story? What were the social, political, legal, religious structures behind those two people and their 5 decades of separation that made that happen? And it was, I really wanted to pick that, the story up, the story that we have, that adoption is best for everybody involved and everybody gets a better life and the birth mother doesn't have to live in shame and the adoptee gets to have married parents and the adoptive parents get to have a family. I wanted to take a look at what that narrative really meant when we held it up to the light. How did we get that? Why did we accept it? Why did we adopt it? Why did we, no pun intended, why did we embrace that narrative without looking what really transpired for millions of Americans?
Greg, at the conference, you are going to moderate a panel. Why don't you give the community a little bit of information about what are you going to focus on? Why is it important to bring everyone together like this? Because there's one person that's not here. Sorry that she is not with us, Shauna. But why is it important for all the community to see what you're going to say?
Yeah, first of all, a shout out to Shauna Hodgins, who's in Texas. She's a Texas adoptee. She's working on legislation down there in Texas and can't make it. So, cross our fingers on that. I think this is it's important to know the history of what has occurred in adoption, even over the last 100 years, and not only in adoptions and relinquishments like Margaret went through and David went through, but what happened and how this industry was essentially built. And there are many parallels that were happening in adoption over the years. You could say that one parallel is the white nuclear family adoption narrative, and that's essentially what's being captured with Margaret and David's story. But there are other parallels that were going on at the same time. There's the Indian Project, which the adoption industry was essentially taking Native American children and putting them into white families. And then there's the in-race or Black American adoption, which was largely ignored and was not part of the white nuclear middle-class family. So therefore, and for other various reasons, there was not an industry around in-race adoptions involving Black families. But all those parallels are going at the same time. And this narrative of secret adoptions and the secrecy that surrounded adoptions is something that affects all of us going forward today. I mean, many of us are older, we're still denied a right to our history and birth records, and we're still fighting for that right. So it's something that people really need to understand what adoption was built on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and how that continues to impact us today and the mythology that surrounds that history.
Thank you.
And Gabrielle's book does a fantastic job of outlining how that was built. And that's why I'm so excited to have her and Margaret on the panel, as well as Shauna, who was involved in part of making of the book as well.
Margaret, is there anything that you'd like to state before we go that I didn't ask you that you want to share of why people should come to the conference and hear your story? Why is it so important?
Because they will learn what has been going on all these years, I think, and also what is still going on, because there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge of this from their research and what they've gone through. From my standpoint, I was never against adoption. I know there were good adoptions and some that were not good, but I think everybody has a right to know where they came from. And I think they'll learn so much as far as the write-ups that even the adoptive parents got on their children that were not true. There are so many different angles of the adoption story. I mean, in New York now, an adoptee can get their birth certificate. A birth mother or father still can't get it. You have your child, they take the child away, and then it's like the child never existed. And even that, there are people in their 90s from the birth mother standpoint or birth father standpoint that don't know, are their children alive? Are they dead? What happened? And the medical, so many different things are so important for people to know, because lots of pain and things can be stopped. Psychologically, I think it's important also for every adopted to know where they came from or what happened or what the background was. Everybody has a different story, but you have a right to know what your story is when you're an adult. I mean, it's crazy. It's just absolutely crazy that life is still going on like this.
Well, lastly, Greg, you want to tell anybody, is there anything that the community can do to help support in different states of how, or is it sharing? Is it just word of mouth? Is there something to help? Do you have to call your legislator? What can we do as a community to help?
It's sort of all of those things. And I really want to acknowledge first, you had a great teacher with Annette teaching you about this issue. That's just perfect. And then also Margaret's comment about birth parents who relinquish children not being able to get a birth, that original birth record, which is absolutely insane and just shows the punishing secrecy that exists, because there's no information on that birth record that the mother or the father don't already know.
No.
But it's locked away and you can't have it. And that punishing secrecy really hurts everybody. But the best thing I think to do for moving on into the future are all the things you just outlined: contacting your legislators, being aware of the issue, being aware of what adoptees mean when they say they have a right to identity and what that right means and what that encompasses. It means that it is a right and they should be able to request the record and obtain it without any kind of discriminatory restrictions. And I would add, just to plug Adoptees United, and that's at adopteesunited.org, is a national organization that is trying to educate not only adopted people and birth parents and adoptive parents on issues of adoptee rights, but the general public. And I would encourage people to sign up there to get notifications of events that we have, as well as legislative activities, because we track legislation across the country and as well as intercountry adoption legislation. So adopteesunited.org is probably one of the best places to get connected to, that then would provide information that people can use across the country.